Okay, so I'm going to start us off um, talking a little bit about this series. It's all about climate resilient farming. Some of the overview that we talked about last week for those who didn't join us about the climate impacts report that was recently released. And then I'll talk a little bit more about pest and disease pressures and the integrated pest management programs and resources through Cornell. And then I'm going to pass it over to Katie to go into more about invasives and climate. Um, and then we'll leave time at the end for Q&A. So starting us off, you can find the recording last week. We talked about longer and more variable growing seasons. And our next scheduled webinar will be going into increased rainfall and water management with some more topics to be announced in January. So keep an eye out for that. But these are all kind of inspired by the recent New York State. Everyone to go read it in full, but there is a whole chapter on agriculture that really takes a deep dive into the different sectors. So it was put out by NYSERDA along with about 250 researchers. So lots of good information. It's geared towards farmers, businesses, decision makers across the state to help prepare for climate change impacts. So some of the major ones that they focused on were more extreme heat and cold events, changes in the amount and duration of precipitation, including hail and drought, more frequent and intense storms, and then for the shoreline communities, sea level rise and saltwater intrusion into farmland. So we'll be focusing more on the ones that are relevant to the Hudson Valley for this series. Some other things of interest, though, that they mentioned in the report were climate change as a threat multiplier for farms, climate justice and equity for farm worker and farming communities that are often more vulnerable, as well as, of course, the climate resilience and adaptation strategies for different impacts. So the link to that is there, and I think somebody could drop it in the chat as well. So today we're going to be focusing in on the increased weed disease and insect damage to crops as the impact for today's session. But we will try to touch on these other ones throughout the series. So starting off, for pests specifically, insects and other invertebrates, our best planning we can do really for these new insects that may be coming into our region as we get these warmer and longer seasons, as well as start dealing with potentially more generations of pests since they have more time to reproduce every season, is what's called integrated pest management. And the goal of IPM really is to reduce pesticide use, use it kind of as your last resort. So there's a number of different practices that are associated with that. And we have some great research show in the slides. But basic idea, first you want to know what you're dealing with. Every insect's going to be, have different prevention and control strategies. So IDing, doing regular scouting are key parts of IPM. Using physical barriers like row cover or tunnels, different cultural practices such as tillage and crop rotation. And then diversifying your species, of course, is going to help. You can either grow resistant varieties or new species of varieties that aren't hosts to the pest that you're, having biggest issues with. And then there are a number of tools based on things like degree days or other predictors that you can use. And those are available on some of the websites I'll share. And then, of course, things like biological controls and biodiversity that can support natural enemies. So, getting more beneficial, growing the flowers that they like and having the habitats that they like. And then, of course, your last tool would be some of your chemical tools, your pesticides. So those would all be part of integrated pest management. And similar for disease, there's the varieties out there that are going to be more resistant to whatever disease you're dealing with. So of course you want to, work on IDing that first and work with your crop experts, specialists that are available through extension. There are chemical tools like fungicides or pesticides, depending on the disease and how it's being spread. Your cultural things again, crop rotation, avoiding overhead irrigation for fungal diseases so that the leaves are not staying as wet for as long, or using controlled growing environments like tunnels are all good options. And then in the livestock world, since that's kind of my specialty, cultural practices to limit parasite load and insect pest or disease vectors. So avoiding standing water, avoiding having tick habitat near where your animals are at. Proper use of insecticides to avoid resistance for things like parasites, nematodes and whatnot, and then monitoring and ability to quarantine and good biosecurity practices would all be part of planning for disease when it comes to livestock. Just wanted to mention, and I think we may hear more about ticks later, but there is an increased risk of tick and mosquito-borne illness for humans too, as we're seeing these warmer seasons, especially warmer winters when we might not be used to thinking about ticks or mosquitoes. We're seeing them later and later into the year. So just making sure you're protecting yourself and people working on your farm are protecting yourself as well. So some of the resources, our New York State IPM program provides lots of research-based resources, fact sheets, etc., and help with decision making for different pests. So they have a number of different program areas: vegetables, fruit, livestock, field crops. They have special sites for organic IPM, so you can find that all on their website. And then the climatesmartfarming.org website is a great resource for different IPM research as well. And then those forecasting tools that I mentioned for different pests, as well as for other things related to climate resilience. Similarly, the Network for Environment and Weather Applications, they have a number of integrated pest management tools as well. You can search by the pest or by the crop. For example, you can go to this link for onion maggot and you'll kind of get a sense of how that works, but they'll tell you, where at any given time based on weather data from your local weather station, what life stage they predict the pest is at, and then what would be the most effective control at that point. So those are all great resources. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to Katie.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Katie. So thank you for joining us today. I will be presenting strategies for climate resilient farming. We're going to cover the impacts and ways that they affect us here in our region, and then added pest and disease pressure and management practices for the opportunistic invasive species that come with climate change. I'm going to turn off my video just because there's been some technical issues that I would like to avoid. But if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, like Haley said, and we'll get to the Q&A at the end. Also, I'm the horticulture program educator here at CCE Sullivan County. Okay. Climate impact. So climate models predict that the Earth will experience a rise in temperature of anywhere from 2 to 9.7 degrees Fahrenheit over the next century. So these are just like a few of the climate change impacts in the Hudson Valley here. So that is it doesn't sound like a lot of degrees, but it is. It makes a huge difference when we're talking about like rising temperatures and growing season. The first thing that comes to mind when we think of climate change is that, these temperatures are going to be super high, but they don't really tell the entire, just the temperature doesn't tell the entire story of the cascading effects that our climate crisis is having on agriculture. We're obviously running into enormous issues with water availability, drought, heat waves, flooding, increased precipitation extreme, maximum and minimum temperature changes, crop loss, and increased pest and disease pressure. One interesting catch-22 about carbon dioxide levels rising is that studies are showing that these increased levels can produce bigger plants much quicker, which sounds like it would be a good thing. However, these bigger, quickly growing plants have less vitamins, minerals, and protein concentrations, so they are making the plants overall less nutritious. So that is a downside of having more CO2 in the atmosphere. Um, Sorry, I don't know why my slides won't go. Okay. So this graphic kind of shows how these pieces interact and impact each other. As you can see, the interactions between climate, crops, and insects are extremely complex. Elevated concentrations of CO2 can impact the rate of food consumption, growth, fertility, and population size of insect pests, which you can kind of see at this bottom right corner here. Um, but then on the left side, you can see that it also increases biomass, growth rate, and photosynthesis rate, which is, it sounds like it would be a good thing, but if overall the plant is less healthy and nutritious, then it's probably not a good thing. Um, these images maybe are familiar to you because I think Brett talked about them at last week's presentation. They're from an orchard here in Sullivan County that had total crop failure in 2023, but their story is not unique. Um, because of the unseasonably warm winter, the fruit blossoms came out of, the tree came out of dormancy early. There were some fruit blossoms, and then a hard frost came and killed um, every single apple tree lost its fruit. So he had zero crops last year. This happened in another farm called Rose Hill Farm in Dutchess County. They lost their entire peach crop 2 years ago. And, farmers will tell you that weather anomalies can happen, but they're becoming more and more common. So that's the scary part, that they're not happening once every 75 years, or happening maybe every 5 years. First and last frost dates are not dependable anymore. Growing zones are changing. Our zone actually changed, I think it was last year or the year before, which was crazy. Um, Another impacted system is water availability. Um, I thought it was interesting to learn that rainfall is the primary water source for 80% of the total crop production globally. So any disturbances in rainfall patterns or precipitation can have devastating consequences for global food production. This is why, I don't know, not that I'm going to get into politics, but I know that there's been a couple senators that have talked about climate refugees on a global scale, that, that's going to be something that might happen in the next 100 years. But this past fall here in Sullivan County, we had drought-like conditions. There was a burn ban. It didn't rain for almost 40 days, which is very not typical. And then often these drought conditions are followed by extremely heavy precipitation events that cause flash flooding. This image is from July of 2023, where 8 inches of rain fell in a matter of, I think, 2 or 3 hours, and it caused both road, Metro North closures. It caused one person's death. Um, but another consequence that isn't always talked about with flooding is runoff that the floodwater carries. It carries contaminants into the neighboring bodies of water. So you have garbage, garage, like chemicals sitting in people's garages, street debris, they all go right into our watershed when we have flooding. So that is another consequence of these extreme weather events that can affect fresh water and clean water availability for growing crops. Um, Frequent heavy rainfalls can damage farmland by flooding, soil erosion, damage to crops, making them vulnerable. Stress from extreme weather events like droughts and floods not only physically damage plants, but they can weaken the plant's defenses, making the crops more susceptible to pests in the first place. Um, so yeah, the takeaway there is kind of with rising temperatures, along comes weather irregularities that aren't always seen in an average temperature or just a high temperature. There's unpredictability and extreme or rare weather events are just happening on a more frequently. Um, so now we'll talk a little bit about the pest pressure that is happening due to climate change. Just want to move this thing out of my way. Okay. Uh, so this picture is of the I don't know if anybody has seen this little creature. It looks like a little like a prehistoric creature, but it's the brown marmorated stink bug. It's from Japan, and it has a huge impact on our apple crop here in New York, which is like a huge crop for the Hudson Valley. But some of the impacts of climate change that are seen in pests are that pests are having range expansion, rising temperatures enable pests to thrive in previously unsuitable regions, including higher altitudes and latitudes. For instance, the fall armyworm has expanded its range into subtropical and temperate zones, and now it's wreaking havoc on crops and forest life there. There's also increased pest activity. The warmer climates lead to faster pest reproduction cycles, higher survival rates, extended active seasons. This can amplify infestations, obviously, because if you had an insect that maybe it was only able to reproduce once in a season, now it's reproducing twice. So that's double the population, which is not a good thing. Pests that are overwintering are having a much higher survival rate than in the past because temperatures are higher. These conditions obviously apply to invasive species as well as they continue to thrive and spread, even though despite costly efforts to thwart them. But yeah, in 2012, the marmorated stink bug had an explosion of population due to ideal weather conditions in the Northeast, and it caused 20 to 30% of crop failure in the Hudson Valley orchard industry. So it's a huge, and it feels like it came out of nowhere. I mean, I don't remember. I think it came to the United States in the 90s, but up until, around then, like 2010, 2012, I never like saw it anywhere. I never heard it anywhere. And then it was just like everywhere. So they can have those population explosions, and that's the scary part. You can't always predict what before that's going to happen. And now we'll talk a little bit about disease, the different diseases that are impacted by climate change. Um, Pathogen proliferation, temperature and humidity are critical for many plant pathogens. Climate change can extend the conditions favorable for fungal, bacterial, and viral diseases, so they're able to persist even longer and better than maybe before they might get killed off in like a cold snap or a hard frost. Now they're not. Shifts in disease distribution, like the pests, the disease caused by pathogens such as rust, blight, and mildew are appearing in new regions due to changing climates. And we're seeing more control resistant strains. So rapid environmental changes may accelerate the evolution of treatment resistant strains, reducing the effectiveness of existing control measures. Um, I don't know if anybody has seen, if you want to put in the chat, if the on the left, if anybody can identify what's going on there. I don't know if anyone grew squash this year, but my squash were just like riddled with this. Um, I don't even know if I can pull up the chat. So if anybody said powdery mildew, you're right, because that's powdery mildew. It's like it just like totally takes over everything and then eventually kills it. So you won't get any fruit or vegetables. Um, okay, so now we'll kind of get into a little bit of like the impacts that climate change is having specifically on invasive species in New York. There are a few key impacts climate change is having on invasive species in New York. These obviously mimic some of the impacts we talked about with the general agricultural pests. Changes in precipitation patterns, increased rainfall, droughts. They create stress for native species, and then they give the invasive species that are incoming a competitive edge, which is not good because they already have no natural predators. So now it's just like, everything's like prime for the taking, and they'll just take over an area, no problem. Uh, the growing seasons. Warmer temperatures and longer growing seasons allow invasive plants, insects, and organisms to expand their regions and reproduce more effectively. So, like Japanese knotweed, for example, it thrives in warm conditions and it outcompetes pretty much every native vegetation that it comes up against. If it's not like a super resilient and biodiverse space, Japanese knotweed is probably going to take over. Um, Another one is like the emerald ash borer. It is now able to complete more life cycles per year, increasing their population. Um, the southern pine beetle continues to move north despite its name and wreak havoc on pines everywhere. And then range expansion, the rising temperatures enable invasive species to move into previously inhospitable regions. So, like the southern pine beetle coming north, it it's nobody thought it would be able to like get a foothold up here, but now that it's warmer up here, it is able to get a foothold. So, um, does anybody recognize this vine on the left here? I'm gonna try to go into the chat. I don't know if I can open it. Um, I don't know, Haley, can you read me some of the?
Yeah, people are just saying kudzu, English ivy, kudzu.
Yeah, it's kudzu. Okay, thank you. So this they call the vine that swallowed the South. Uh, This is a terrestrial species that is moving northward due to milder winters. It's all over Long Island, as you can see, and it's slowly creeping up to the northern counties. Um, when it wasn't able to even exist up here before, like previously, and now if you drive on like the New York State Thruway, it's all over the Thruway, it's all over the Cross Island Parkway. It's just like, it's all over Long Island. I see it every time I go down there. And if anyone's ever like been down south, I mean, there's just like total forests that have been taken over by it's insane. It's just all over the place. It grows so fast. Like once it's established, it can grow up to a foot a day, and it just swallows everything in its path. It's totally it's totally destructive, but the problem because of its aggressive growth and extensive root system, it needs repeated herbicide treatments. That's the most common way to control it, or just physical removal. It looks like there's some promising research on having livestock eat it. They seem to like it, but it's crazy, this plant. It is notorious for growing over anything in its path. It easily outcompetes other native plants as it covers them and blocks out sunlight. It also will girdle and uproot trees, shrubs. And yeah, like I said, it can grow up to a foot a day, which is wild. But yeah, it thrives. It grows especially quickly in warm, humid temperatures, which is why it likes the American South. So as our summers get more humid and hotter, it's just going to keep spreading. Forest ecosystems are vulnerable as invasive pests like the hemlock woolly adelgid exploit stressed trees weakened by changing weather patterns. They also, up here, we're experiencing higher numbers of hemlock woolly adelgid overwintering successfully because our winters have been a little bit milder, which is a scary thing. But yeah, so Milder winters reduce mortality rates for invasive insects. Reduced cold snaps may fail to kill off larvae or eggs of invasive species, like, for example, the spotted lanternfly. I'm sure everybody recognizes this creature. This is just some information about it, where it came from. It's a plant hopper. It came on a stone shipment to Pennsylvania, Berks County, Pennsylvania in 2014. If you look at the list on the right, there's really no plant or tree that this spotted lanternfly doesn't impact. It'll lay its eggs on pretty much any surface, and it'll find food in like most plants. Um, and then it creates the black fungus called sooty mold when it excretes the honeydew. And I don't know if anyone has ever seen an infestation of spotted lanternfly, but it's a crazy thing to see. I actually have a video that I wanted to show you guys. So you can see how they would just decimate um, a grapevine. They damage the vines by their sapsuckers, so they just keep sucking the vines and they damage the plant that way, and then the fruit will fail. But not only that, they drop all this honeydew on the leaves, which sounds nice, but it's not. It creates this sooty mold that can eventually kill the plant. And not only that, but it attracts stinging insects, which nobody wants near them. So, okay. And then these are just some of the headlines that we see regarding the serious implications of spotted lanternfly, as it poses more of a threat to agriculture, to wildlife, and to our vineyards in the Finger Lakes region, which I know everybody was freaking out that the spotted lanternfly, like, we can't let it get up to the Finger Lakes, the the wineries up there, and now they've been spotted in the wineries, so it's not a good thing. Um, and this just means more pest pressure, just means more chemicals, which is not great for anybody. Um, yeah, so this is like, this is around the time in the research that you just start like freaking out. You're like, oh my God, I'm so anxious. Let's look at all the bad things that are happening and we're doomed. But um, don't fret, because there are solutions and there are adaptive strategies that farmers are having success with, and gardeners. So now we'll get into some of those. Um, so most of these solutions kind of fall under the umbrella of integrated pest management, which is a sustainable way to manage pests by combining biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools when necessary, which Catherine touched on before. But we also want to think outside the box and apply kind of a holistic and different adaptive agricultural methods to boost the resiliency of our farms by avoiding monocultures. The first thing is diversifying crops. Applying holistic and adaptive agricultural methods will boost resiliency. We can do that by planting varieties. We can use drought-resistant crops, include varieties like sorghum, millet, or drought-tolerant corn to handle water shortages. Investing in water management, use drip irrigation systems to conserve water, build retention ponds and rain gardens to manage excessive rainfall and reduce flooding risks. We can also adopt crop rotation and intercropping, rotating crops to prevent soil depletion and reduce pest infestations. When you rotate your crops, you kind of confuse the pests and they don't necessarily stick around if they're used to having, let's say they're, cucumbers have always been grown there. You're not going to get those same infestations if the next year you plant peas. And then also if you plant peas, they're adding nutrients back into the soil. So That's an important thing to do. But yeah, if you alternate between like beans and corn, practice intercropping, such as growing corn with beans, um, you're gonna maximize your land use and also enhance soil fertility while preventing infestations. Another mitigation strategy is cover crops. You can use clover, rye, vetch. There's a ton, alfalfa. There's even some like leafy greens you could use to protect soil during off seasons. And this improves water retention, it reduces erosion, and it adds nutrients back into the soil. Um, Another strategy is incorporating agroforestry. Combine trees or shrubs with crops or livestock to create more resilient ecosystems. For example, grow berries under the canopy of nut trees or introduce silvopasture and permaculture systems. Anyway, yeah, so incorporating agroforestry, which is kind of like in the same vein as silvopasture or permaculture. And this is a practice that integrates tree, forage, and grazing of domesticated animals in a mutually beneficial way. Um, Permaculture is similar to like regenerative farming. You use whole systems designs to mimic flourishing ecology. Um, Stay tuned for a permaculture series this spring or summer, which should be coming. Um, and then another one is a bioswale. I don't know if anyone's heard of this. This is another way to manage areas that are prone to flooding. The channel that acts as a filter for stormwater runoff. They collect debris, and then they usually have native plants that are flood tolerant and happy in standing water, like native grasses and willows do really well in like swampy land. But I think I skipped the bottom part here. Let me just go back here. So about monitoring pest populations, if anyone has ever used IMAP invasives to report an invasive in the area, you can also use this as a tool to see what infestations have been confirmed in your area. So if you go in there, I think you have to make like a login, but you can check where the infestations are, what invasives are in your area, how big the populations are. And then another thing that farmers used to do when I used to be an ag inspector in San Diego, and a lot of the farmers, especially organic farmers, would use sticky traps to monitor the pests in their farm. So even though you're not expecting to catch all of them on the sticky traps, you can kind of see what's there. So that's a good way to monitor, like if you're what issues you're having on your particular land, and if any of them are invasives, and then you could figure out like mitigation strategies for them. Um, so battling the invasives. For the spotted lanternfly, manual removal of the tree of heaven is going to help because that is an invasive tree that they absolutely love. And if you have one, they will 100% infest it. If you see the picture on the left, the bottom left, the top of the image is tree of heaven, and then there's like a lookalike. We have a ton of sumac here, so don't mistake the sumac for tree of heaven. The sumac is good. You can make good lemonade or iced tea out of the little flowers here. But the the tree of heaven also releases a chemical that prevents other plants and trees from growing. So it's really just a menace to have in any sort of setting. We don't want it growing here. And then the top left picture is again that black sooty mold that will form once the spotted lanternfly leaves the honeydew on the trees. The picture in the middle is an image of what their egg masses look like. So anytime you see them, like, that's a huge thing, just removing any egg masses that you see. They lay them like around September, and then they start to hatch like April in our region. So now is a great time to look for them when the trees are bare and there's no leaves and it's kind of easier to see what's going on. Another positive, a study was done by the University of Illinois, and they were testing crop nets to prevent spotted lanternflies from getting into their orchards in an infested county. So the the netted trees only had two spotted lanternflies the whole season. They only found two in any of the netted crops. And the unnetted crops obviously had like many more, and then a bunch of egg masses as well. So it's a lot of work to put these up, but especially if you're an organic farmer, it's something that you might think about. It also helps prevent other pests, as you can imagine, so that you don't have to use as much spray. It also helps stop the birds from getting in the trees and eating the crops. But you're also able to spray through them. So if you are a conventional farmer, then you can also spray through them and it's no problem. But yeah, with the spotted lanternfly, removal and like prevention is going to be the biggest piece of it. If you can stop the infestation from coming to your area, that's much easier than having to remove it once it's there. So you always want to be monitoring for egg masses. Like Catherine said, only use insecticides as a last resort. There are different like kind of like DIY traps that you can make that you can put around your trees. There's nets. They say if you vacuum them up, you can do that. The sticky traps, obviously, if you see them, you kill them, which they're kind of hard to kill because they're really fast. But yeah, they can lay their eggs on anything also. So if you have, you know, patio furniture, a barbecue, a patio, like a deck or anything, like you want to always be checking for any sort of, I mean, really with any sort of egg masses of any insect, you want to just scrape them off. Another big one is like the gypsy moth. I'm sorry, the spongy moth caterpillar. They will also put their egg masses on anything. So you kind of just want to be mindful and be looking at your trees and looking around to see where these egg masses are. And now we'll talk about managing Japanese knotweed, which is another huge one here in Sullivan County. It was introduced from East Asia in the late 1800s on purpose, which is always sad to hear that somebody brought this on purpose. Somebody thought this was pretty, which is wild. But this is how you identify it. This is what it looks like. It has these bamboo-like stems with the purple splotching. It gets these cute little white flowers in late summer and a zigzag leaf pattern on the stem. So it's like alternate leaves. And then it has the heart spade-shaped leaves, obviously. With removing Japanese knotweed, it seems like all of the research that CRISP or Cornell has done kind of there's two ways to get rid of it. You can manually cut it back and cut it back and cut it back and then smother the area with tarp and plant some really hardy natives in its place. It still might come back. It's probably will keep coming back and back again and again and again. And then other people will spray Roundup on it, which, you can decide whether or not you want to do that. I mean, we all live in a watershed. There's a ton of water up here in Sullivan County. So if you're close to water at all, you should not use Roundup because it's not safe to use near water. If the soil is soft, you got to dig out all the rhizomes because that's how it's going to spread underground. You have to do it for many years in a row. But even if you use the herbicide, you also have to do that for many years in a row, and it'll still take time for it, to really get rid of it. I have a neighbor who successfully got rid of his. He didn't have a huge infestation, but he had some, and he rented an excavator. He ripped it all out, and then he put stones and a bunch of oak trees in its place, and it has not come back. He says once in a while, like it'll sprout up, and he just rips it out, and it's like no big deal, but it's not coming back. So he successfully got rid of it. So it's possible without using Roundup. But if you do want to use Roundup, there is a recommended herbicide application schedule from Penn State Extension. Again, you just don't want to use it near water. It's harmful to frogs and fish, and it shouldn't get into our watershed. Kudzu. So you see the distribution here. This is why they call it the vine that swallowed the South. It's everywhere. It's most likely, I mean, this kind of shows that it's all over New York, but it's in New York, so this is kind of like a broader map. But the ways that they are managing kudzu is you have to remove the root crown. It must be removed and killed. And because of the numerous root crowns, it takes years, kind of like the Japanese knotweed. You're gonna have to keep cutting it back, keep removing it, keep just, it's like relentless, this stuff. So it's really, you have to like not let it get established in the first place. And that's why it's so important to have like public outreach and education about these things so that you can identify them before they're, taking over entire forests. The mechanical harvesting of kudzu by mowing every 2 weeks can take up to 10 years, but it also seems to be taking that long if you're using the herbicide. So they also, like I said earlier, I guess they are having livestock graze, and that has been successful too. So having goats come and eat it because they'll eat anything. So the southern pine beetle, this we talked about before. It was really widespread in the south, but now it's coming up north because of our warmer. It kind of has the same distribution as the kudzu. It's in Long Island because Long Island is much warmer, and now it's moving its way up north as our winters become milder. But they're just like wreaking havoc on our pines. They're no longer just in the south. Now they're up in the north. And they are a wood borer, so once they get into the tree, there's really no way to save the tree. They just do too much damage to the circulatory system. So there's a lot of, I think the state has a survey where they look for infestations so that they can remove the trees that are infested before it spreads anyplace else. They also are felling trees and removing them from the area to stop the spread. So they're not great flyers. They can't go very far. So if like there's a lot of space between the pine trees, they're not really gonna have too bad of an infestation. But yeah, there are many, I guess we're kind of running out of time. There are specific ways to combat each of the invasive species. There's dozens of them. I have great resources if you have a particular one that you are trying to get rid of or eradicate on your farm or in your garden. I can share that information via email, but the last piece that I kind of wanted to talk about was promoting resilience and biodiversity as much as we can. This is the way that we prevent invasives from even gaining a foothold in our local ecology to begin with. Even if you're not a farmer, you can do this in your backyard, in your garden, even on your patio, even if you don't have a lot of outdoor space. This is a really great resource here. This website, I'm going to click on it in a second. This was created by an entomologist named Doug Tallamy. They did a national study on the most productive species in each ecoregion that do 90% of they do the bulk of the work that drives food webs in our region. So I'm just going to click on it so you guys can take a look, see what I'm talking about. They have a whole website here, the National Wildlife Federation. So if you don't live necessarily in this ecoregion, you can look up what keystone plants are in your ecoregion. But these are hugely supportive of native pollinators and not just bees. not just the European honeybee. They support the native bee species that are like specialists. So you can see white oak is like the number one, and it supports 445 caterpillar species, which obviously like cascades through the whole food web. Um, but these are the best trees, shrubs, flowering perennials, and I think there's vines on here too that you can plant in our area to support biodiversity and to help prevent these invasive species from getting a foothold in our ecology in the first place. And I always plug oak trees because they suppress Japanese siltgrass, which is an invasive that we have. And also, if you have an oak tree, the leaf litter that the oak tree drops suppresses Asian jumping worms, and they will not establish in an area that has uh, oak tree leaf litter because it's too leathery for them. So, um, yep, that's my presentation. So I guess we'll get to the Q&A session. Haley, I'll turn it over to you.